Death is treated as the most obvious fact in human existence, not because we understand it, but because we rely on it. From childhood onward, we are taught that life moves forward, then stops. Stories end, bodies fail, people disappear. This belief is so deeply embedded that it rarely feels like a belief at all. It feels like a background rule, something as solid as gravity or distance. Entire cultures are built around this assumption. Languages encode it. Rituals reinforce it. Even fear depends on it. Death is framed as a line that cannot be crossed, a final punctuation mark placed at the end of everything we are. Once crossed, no continuity, no presence, no remainder. But notice something subtle. This certainty does not come from science. It comes from experience. We observe bodies becoming still. We observe voices going silent. We infer an ending because perception runs out of things to track when observation stops, meaning stops with it. Physics, however, does not begin with meaning. It begins with accounting. It asks what exists, how it changes, and whether anything truly vanishes. In that language, endings are strangely absent. Processes transform. States evolve. Systems rearrange themselves. But nowhere in the foundational structure is there a rule that allows something to simply cease. The discomfort begins here. If death feels final because observation ends and physics does not recognize observation as an ending, then the certainty we carry may rest on a misunderstanding, not about death itself, but about what an ending actually is. That assumption has never been tested against the laws that govern reality itself, only against human limits of sight, memory, and language, which were never designed to measure what persists beyond direct experience over time universally. Physics does not contain a category called death. This is not philosophical resistance. It is structural absence. The fundamental laws describe motion, interaction, transformation, and conservation. They describe how systems change, not how they terminate. When something appears to end, physics asks what configuration replaced it. Biology tells a story of breakdown. Cells fail, processes stop coordinating, and the organism can no longer sustain itself. That story feels like an ending because it occurs at the scale we inhabit. But physics operates beneath that scale. Atoms do not recognize the collapse of a body as an event worth recording. Particles continue interacting exactly as before, obeying the same equations without interruption. From a physical perspective, nothing halts. Energy does not vanish. Matter does not disappear. Information is not permitted to simply erase itself. Every component that once participated in a living system continues participating in the universe. The laws insist on continuity, even when experience insists on loss. This creates a quiet conflict. Humans define death as a moment where nothing happens anymore. Physics defines reality as a system where something is always happening. The mismatch is not emotional. It is conceptual. We are projecting a boundary that the laws themselves do not draw. What we call death is therefore not a physical event in the fundamental sense. It is a failure of organization, not existence. A pattern dissolves, but the constituents remain active, traceable, and governed. The unsettling implication is not that life secretly continues. It is that physics never acknowledges a stopping point at all. If the universe does not allow true halts, then the idea of a final moment may belong to biology and psychology, not to reality itself. And if nothing truly stops, the question becomes unavoidable. If the laws never stop anything, what exactly stops you? This realization quietly destabilizes the certainty we place around ending. It suggests that finality is a story told by limited observers, not a feature enforced by the universe. Death marks where our measurements fail. not where reality agrees to stop, and nothing beyond that boundary is actually removed, ever. Its unsettling power does not come from claims or conclusions, but from a habit of noticing what equations quietly assume. Feynman never framed death as a mystery to be solved. He treated it as something stranger, a concept that never appears where it should. When he described nature, he focused on processes that continue without pause, even when our language insists something has ended. What disturbed him was not mortality, but accounting. In physics, every interaction leaves a trace. Every event reshapes the system it touches. Nothing simply exits the story. When something changes form, the equations remain calm, tracking every contribution forward. From that perspective, the disappearance we associate with death is mathematically invisible. Feynman emphasized this without drama. He pointed out that the universe keeps perfect books. Energy is conserved. Information, in principle, is conserved. These are not philosophical positions. They are structural constraints. They leave no room for absolute loss, only redistribution. The discomfort arises when this precision is compared to human intuition. We feel that people vanish because relationships collapse and signals stop arriving. Physics sees only a rearrangement of interactions. The atoms that once carried thought and memory do not leave the universe. They continue participating, indistinguishable from any others, obeying the same laws they always did. Feynman never said this meant survival. He was careful about that. What he implied was subtler and more unsettling. If the laws never describe true removal, then the feeling of finality cannot be rooted in physics itself. It must come from the observer. This shifts the problem. Death stops stories, not equations. It ends narratives, not processes. From the universe's perspective, nothing dramatic has occurred. Only a particular pattern has ceased to maintain itself. That realization is uncomfortable because it suggests something important. If physics never records a moment of absolute departure, then what we call disappearance may be an artifact of perspective, not a fundamental feature of reality. Disappearance feels obvious because it aligns perfectly with how human perception works. We experience the world through continuity of signals. When signals stop, we interpret absence. A voice goes silent, a body cools. Movement no longer responds. The brain translates this break in feedback into a conclusion. Something is gone. But physics does not measure presence the way perception does. It does not rely on signals reaching a nervous system. It tracks states and interactions whether or not anyone is there to notice them. From that perspective, nothing has disappeared. The processes that once formed a living system have simply decoupled from the patterns we recognize. This gap creates an illusion. Humans confuse loss of access with loss of existence. When we can no longer interact with something in familiar ways, we label it absent. Yet absence in physics requires more than silence. It requires violation of conservation, a removal from the system that never occurs. The illusion deepens because identity itself is pattern. Based, we recognize a person not by atoms, but by behavior, memory, and continuity. When those patterns collapse, the identity vanishes, even though the physical components remain fully present and active. The mind treats pattern failure as erasure. Physics treats it differently. Patterns form, persist, and dissolve constantly. None of them are privileged. A hurricane ends, a flame extinguishes, a star collapses. In each case, nothing leaves reality. The arrangement changes, and the universe moves on without recording a loss. Disappearance, then, is not something the universe performs. It is something observers conclude when their models stop working. What feels like vanishing is often just the point where perception reaches its limit, while reality continues uninterrupted beyond it. Nothing in physics marks that boundary. It exists only where human tracking, memory, and meaning fall apart, completely, silently. Time feels destructive because memory is selective. We experience moments arriving, then disappearing, replaced by new ones. The past feels inaccessible, sealed behind the present. From that perspective, death appears absolute because time seems to erase what came before it. Physics does not describe time this way. In its equations, moments are not destroyed as new ones appear. Events are ordered, not deleted. A past interaction does not stop existing because something else happens later. It remains part of the structure that determines everything that follows. This creates a problem for the idea of erasure. If time does not remove events, then nothing that has happened is physically gone. The universe does not discard its history. Every interaction leaves traces that shape future states. The present is not cleanly separated from the past. It is constrained by it. Relativity intensifies this discomfort. In that framework, time is not a universal flow sweeping moments away. It is part of a space-time structure where past, present, and future are all embedded. Different observers slice this structure differently, but none of them eliminate what already exists. From that view, the idea that someone no longer exists becomes ambiguous. If their past interactions are still part of space-time, still influencing the present through causal chains, then existence has not been erased. It is simply moved out of direct access. Death feels final because time feels like a one-way eraser. Physics treats time as a dimension, not a shredder. Events do not vanish. They become fixed. Nothing in the laws allows the past to be undone or removed. This reframing quietly destabilizes what we mean by gone. If time itself does not destroy what exists, then death cannot rely on time to erase a life from reality. It can only change where that life resides within the structure of the universe. The unsettling implication is subtle. If the past still exists physically, then no longer alive does not mean no longer real. It means no longer present in the narrow slice we call now. That distinction matters more than intuition wants to admit quietly deeply. You are taught to think of existence as a single stretch, beginning at birth and ending at death. One line, one arc, one chance. Identity feels bound to that line, as if you appear, persist briefly, then vanish. This model is intuitive, but it is not how physics describes existence at all. In physics, objects are not defined by moments, but by world lines. A world line is an extended structure, a trace through space-time, that includes every state an object ever occupies. Nothing about it exists only once. Every moment of it is equally real within the structure, even if you can only experience one slice at a time. This reframes what it means to exist. You are not a point moving forward. You are an extended pattern spread across time. Your childhood, your present thoughts, and your final biological moments are not erased as new ones appear. They coexist as different regions of the same physical object. From this perspective, the idea of only one life becomes misleading. Not because life repeats, but because existence is not confined to a fleeting now. The parts of you that existed decades ago are still part of reality, still embedded in space-time, still exerting influence through causal chains. Death, then, does not terminate a world line. It marks where a certain kind of organization stops extending further. The line does not vanish behind that point. It simply does not grow. This is deeply uncomfortable because identity is usually tied to awareness. We equate existence with experience. Physics does not. It treats experience as a local phenomenon inside a much larger structure. When awareness ends, the structure does not retract. You never existed only once in the sense that matters to physics. Your existence was never a single moment that could be deleted. It was always an extended object, already complete in one direction, incomplete in another, and never confined to the fragile present you mistake for the whole of reality. It forces a reconsideration of self, not as a temporary visitor in time, but as a persistent structure reality never fully removes at all. It would be tempting to treat the persistence of existence as reassurance, if nothing ever truly disappears. Perhaps death is not final. Perhaps endings are illusions, and some version of us continues indefinitely. But physics does not provide comfort. It offers precision, indifference, and relentless continuity. The persistence of matter and information is not survival. It does not carry memory, awareness, or identity. The atoms that once formed thought do not preserve thought itself. They simply participate in other interactions, indifferent to what they once constituted. This distinction is critical. Continuity at the physical level does not imply personal survival. What persists is rearrangement, not consciousness. Your experiences, emotions, and perceptions vanish even as your components continue. The universe does not care. It is not benevolent nor cruel. It simply obeys laws that treat patterns as transient, reusable, and unbound by narrative expectations. This removes any emotional scaffolding we might cling to. There is no hidden comfort in the equations, no hidden preservation of self. Death is still absolute in the sense of subjective experience. What physics preserves is impersonal, unrelatable, and indifferent. Your identity cannot be tracked beyond the point where your organized patterns collapse. The realization is quietly destabilizing. The universe does not grant immortality, nor does it deliver closure. It simply continues. There is no purpose, no memory, no acknowledgement. In the relentless flow of physical processes, we are simultaneously permanent and irrelevant. That paradox is not soothing. It is precise, and it forces a confrontation with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Physics, for all its clarity, has limits in what it can express in human terms. Equations are precise, but they are not stories. They track interactions, energy, and information, yet they cannot convey meaning, significance, or emotional weight. They operate in silence. They never comment on what should matter to consciousness. They do not label outcomes as tragic, comforting, or unjust. They simply calculate what occurs. This refusal to speak in human language creates tension. We demand answers about death, identity, and permanence, but the universe offers none. It provides structure, rules, and continuity, yet it leaves interpretation entirely to observers. The laws themselves never assert that anything has ended. They describe transformations, redistributions, and interactions, but they never declare finality. Here, the discomfort intensifies. When we attempt to map our fears onto physics, we find gaps. We project narrative closure onto processes that do not acknowledge it. There is no punctuation at the end of a life, only unbroken continuity in that void between what we feel and what exists, meaning collapses. Feynman often highlighted these silences. He insisted that understanding the laws requires accepting what they omit as much as what they reveal. The unspoken parts are as important as the written equations. They remind us that physics does not reassure, moralize, or comfort. It does not validate human concepts of beginning and end. Confronted with this, we realize that the universe maintains perfect bookkeeping, but refuses to explain the significance of any entry. Patterns persist, interactions unfold, and systems continue, yet the ultimate human questions, why, what does it mean, remain unanswerable. That is the quiet, persistent unease physics leaves behind. It is not melodramatic. It is absolute, impartial, and unavoidable. We are trained to see death as a boundary, a definitive edge to existence. We mark it with ceremonies, with words, with a shared understanding that something ends completely at that point. But physics refuses to recognize such a line. No equation acknowledges a termination in absolute terms. Patterns collapse, systems reorganize, but nothing truly exits the universal ledger. Consider what it means for a boundary to exist physically. It would require a rule that allows a portion of reality to vanish, to be excised from all interactions, leaving no trace. Nothing in the fundamental laws permits this. Energy, matter, and information persist through transformation. Conservation laws guarantee that while organization may fail, the components themselves continue in new forms, obeying the same predictable rules. This insight is profoundly destabilizing. Our instinct is to imagine a clean cut, a cessation that isolates what once existed. Yet reality provides no such demarcation. The apparent finality is entirely a construct of observation. Once perception stops, the mind declares an ending. The universe, however, records nothing. It simply continues. Patterns that composed identity dissolve, but the building blocks remain. They integrate with other structures, reshape interactions, and propagate influence. From the perspective of the cosmos, there is no cessation, only transformation. Death is therefore not a physical boundary. It is a human interpretation of a limit that does not exist. The implication is unavoidable. The ultimate line we rely on for certainty is imaginary. Our need for closure imposes a false boundary on reality. There is no final fence marking the end of a life, only the ongoing motion of the universe, indifferent to our concepts, leaving no evidence that anything has ever truly stopped.